All right. So, the Joe Biden administration recently made a pretty significant, albeit not far enough, in my opinion, change to how marijuana is going to be treated at the federal level here in the United States. So, obviously, if you guys remember, back, I think it was in last October, Biden, right ahead of the midterms, obviously trying to motivate young people to come out and vote for Democrats, basically announced that he was going to be initiating some sort of like long, drawn out review process and sort of teasing the idea of either rescheduling or decriminalizing marijuana. And again, there was a lot of a political nature behind that, and it's no coincidence now that I think we're getting this announcement as we are sort of getting closer towards the next presidential election as well. Obviously, again, Joe Biden has been struggling with young people, and so this may be some portion of a way of him trying to reach out and motivate them. Will that be enough? I tend to have my doubts, especially because he's only rescheduling this, as we can see here from Politic. He's not actually going the full extent and decriminalizing weed at the federal level, which I think is just completely ridiculous. But let's just go ahead and read some of the details here from this article of Natalie Fertig and Paul Demko. They say, the Biden administration's Department of Health and Human Services is recommending that the Drug Enforcement Administration significantly loosen federal restrictions on marijuana, but stopped short of advising that it should be entirely removed from the Controlled Substances Act, which would obviously make sense. I mean, listen, you have things like alcohol, you have things like tobacco that are not even nearly, controlled in this under this Controlled Substances Act or have the same regulations as something like weed. But I mean, you could make a serious case that both tobacco and alcohol are significantly more dangerous and having a negative health impact on the American people than something like weed. Now, why are those not on the same list or in the same classification as something like marijuana? Well, that has a lot to do with politics. That has a lot to do with these, the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry that, has worked their way into our political system to keep themselves in sort of a separate category because they are so dominant culturally. I think weed is the same thing, right? Obviously, it can be bad for some people if you're using it too much or if you're relying on it too much or something like that, but it can also be a good thing for people, right? There's tons of medical uses for marijuana. It's also just something that's fun to do from time to time, right? Totally reasonable that this would be something that would be fully decriminalized and actually legalized and taxed and regulated here in the United States, right? There's no reason in my mind that, alcohol should be considered as some sort of like, safer alternative where weed is, historically for the last number of decades been in the most restrictive category under the Controlled Substances Act. So again, they're removing it from Schedule 1, which is the most strict, but they're basically just bumping it down a couple of different levels, right? So they say the health agency wants the drug removed or moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, potentially the biggest change in federal drug policy in decades. So, I mean, I guess you could say the best part of this is that, yeah, it is a significant step. It's like the only step that we have taken to try to like somewhat begin the process of unwinding the failed war on drugs that has been launched since essentially the Nixon administration. Now, I do want to point out, as I usually do when we're talking about the drug war, some of the origins or at least the testimonies about why the drug war was really initiated back during about the 1970s, and we can hear it directly from a Nixon advisor. So here from John Ehrlichman, this is a direct quote. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum for the April cover story. They say, you understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So, I mean, again, don't take my word for it. That is the origin of the war on drugs. That is how we ended up in this position where something like marijuana is put in the Controlled Substances Act at all, number one, but also put at the top of the list. So they continue here. They say, the HHS letter is part of the official review process initiated by Biden last October. The FDA conducts the review, which is then sent to the National Institute on Drug Abuse and HHS, after which the HHS then transmits a letter of recommendation. I mean, this whole process is just fucking ridiculous, right? To the DEA. The DEA is not required then to follow HHS's recommendation. And they said the White House on Wednesday refused to comment on the review process. And I guess their argument here is they want like some sort of a, independent, process to play out here. I mean, I guess I could see a stretch of an argument for that, but like also this is something you should be running on, right? If you're doing this to try to appeal to young voters or appeal to the overwhelming majority of Americans, it's not just young people who support legalizing marijuana, then why would you not be shouting it from the rooftops, right? Why would you not be trying to put pressure on this process? I mean, again, it's completely ridiculous. Even if they say this is an independent review process, right? I mean, this has existed in the controlled substances list as a Schedule 1 drug for decades, right? So I wouldn't exactly like trust the status quo. I wouldn't exactly like trust these same institutions to get it 100% right, given that it's existed in this place for decades and decades and decades with no reasonable changes or adjustments to it. So on the political level, on the, actual sort of logistical level, I think the Biden administration should be commenting on this process. And again, they point out here that the DEA is apparently not required to follow their recommendations. So I guess this might actually not happen. Maybe the DEA is sort of just going to fall in line with this. I would hope that that's the case, but we'll have to see how this plays out. They continue, though. They say cannabis is currently a Schedule 1 substance on the CSA, which means it is deemed to have a high likelihood of abuse and no medical use. So that's just, again, completely false, right? They say heroin and LSD are also Schedule 1 drugs, and Schedule 3 drugs are categorized as having moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. Okay, so it seems more accurate to what marijuana actually is, right? They say the category includes ketamine and testosterone. They say the HHS recommendation is the result of a nearly year-long federal review of all available marijuana research. Biden's executive action, which also included federal pardons for low-level marijuana convictions, was seen by many as a political move taken ahead of the midterm elections to incentivize, again, younger turnout, progressive turnout, all of that good stuff, which I think it absolutely was. It doesn't mean that it can't be a good thing at the same time, obviously, but they say at the time, advocates and some lawmakers urged Biden to take clear steps to just remove it completely from the CSA versus rescheduling it, and legalization advocates on Wednesday reiterated that rescheduling it wouldn't solve many of the problems that they've been asking the Biden administration to correct. And I got a quote here. They say, rescheduling cannabis from 1 to 3 does not end criminalization, it just rebrands it. People will still be subject to criminal penalties for mere possession, regardless of their legal status in a state-level medical program. So, I mean, again, that's 100% correct. And it's just such a Joe Biden thing, right? Where even if he's doing this for political reasons, regardless of the reasons he's doing this, right? This is every single issue with Joe Biden, is he'll take some idea, some policy concept that is wildly popular among the American people, and then he'll just sort of like meet the other side, meet the right-wing Democrats, or meet the Republicans halfway, when it's just totally unnecessary. I mean, again, this is something that is being handled at the federal level. This is something that is not actually being passed through Congress. Now, you may have to pass some sort of like, bills to sort of like regulate the market once it is completely legalized, and you would have to pass that through Congress, but this is executive actions that he's taking here, right? And it's just such a typical Joe Biden thing to just sort of like half-ass it, right? Oh, we're just going to take it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. We're not actually going to do the thing that the overwhelming majority of the American people want us to do and just completely, legalize it, right? Completely decriminalize it, right? And it's the same thing with things like, student loan debt. It's like, okay, I'm not going to wipe the debt slate clean. I'm going to use some like bizarre COVID era justification to cut like 10 to 20,000, depending on if you have this kind of grant or this kind of grant. And it's like, why? Why are we doing this unnecessary means testing? It ends up costing more many times when you're doing means testing on a program like student loan debt. And I mean, again, Build Back Better, another great example, right? Have that $3.5 trillion one that even the majority of West Virginia voters and constituents supported. Manchin, the guy from West Virginia, tears it up into a million pieces, and then we end up with the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, every single thing that Joe Biden does is exactly in this kind of a way, right? It's like, okay, sure, I like the fact that you're taking it off of, Schedule 1 on this list, but also it should just be decriminalized. It should just be legalized. Like, why can you not just take that additional step? And the other aspect of this is, again, this is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I could even see arguments that like corporate Democrats or, Republicans could get behind legalizing, taxing, and regulating marijuana, because that's going to make a bunch of people money, right? I mean, that's going to bring in more tax revenue. That's going to create jobs. I mean, so many different arguments you could make, not just beyond the fact that it's ridiculous that it's criminalized in the first place, right? But we'll finish off here just with a couple of the actual things that are going to happen as this is on Schedule 3, right? How is that actually going to make a difference logistically, like for this industry? So they continue here. They say Federal law has failed to keep up with massive changes over the last decade in state cannabis policies. 23 states, so almost like half, now allow anyone at least 21 years old to legally possess the drug, while 38 states have established medical marijuana programs. But because cannabis businesses are not federally legal, they are subject to a federal tax code that prohibits narcotics traffickers from typical tax exemptions for business expenses like salaries and benefits. That code does not apply to Schedule 3, so that seems like a good thing, right? So if the DEA approved HHS's recommendation, cannabis businesses around the country would immediately be paying much less in federal taxes and would actually like fold into what a normal business would be doing, it seems like. So they say rescheduling could also mean legislative changes on Capitol Hill, where a bill to make it easier for banks to offer financial services to the cannabis industry, backed by Chuck Schumer and Steve Daines and Jeff Merkley, has been slowly prodding towards the finish line. So like, again, maybe or maybe not this will be paired with some sort of federal legislation. I kind of have my doubts on that, but especially considering we have a split Congress with Dems in control in the Senate, Republicans in control of the House. But they say the shift in federal cannabis policy would also make it easier to conduct research on the health effects of cannabis consumption and for pharmaceutical companies to bring cannabis-based drugs to market. They say researchers have long chafed at the restrictions that only allow them to procure cannabis from a single farm at the University of Mississippi. They're just growing a bunch of weed at Mississippi, okay? That bears little resemblance to the high-potency products that many consumers are purchasing in state legal markets. Okay, so I mean, there you have it. Those are some of the major differences that are going to start to play out. Again, I guess we have to wait to see what the DEA's final conclusion on this. Hopefully they just stick with what the HHS guidelines are. But, again, it's a typical Joe Biden thing where it's like, okay, sure, good job. This is a step in the right direction. Again, we haven't had any major shift like this essentially since the drug war began. So I think it's definitely a positive thing. I think it will be beneficial, for the American people broadly across the country, especially as this is like sort of another emerging industry again. And, obviously, it's a step in the right direction, but, it doesn't go nearly far enough. And we need to just simply legalize, tax, regulate marijuana. There's absolutely no reason why alcohol should be able to have its own market, tobacco should be able to have its own legal market, and that marijuana should be considered some sort of more like dangerous, scary kind of thing. So, there you have it. I'll keep you guys updated as we get more of this, but it seems like this is Joe Biden's attempt to sort of make an appeal to young people as we're heading towards the next election. And young people, it seems like, are not really enjoying him at the moment. Definitely, the worst in terms of generational polling for Joe Biden. So, you can see why he's doing something like this, but is it going to be enough? Probably not, considering the fact that you are kind of like half-assing it and people are going to have to look into the, nuanced details about how this is going to improve cannabis and maybe, lead us on the path to eventual federal legalization. But it is what it is. That's just Joe Biden for you.